the lighthouse keeper's guest. The ferry to Merrow Island ran only once a week, and even then, only when the weather allowed. Thomas Ashford had missed 3 crossings already, watching from the mainland dock as the captain shook his head and pointed to the gray-green sky, the restless water, the way the gulls flew low and urgent. But on this 4th Wednesday, the sea lay calm as breath, and the captain gave a curt nod. Thomas climbed aboard with his single suitcase and a leather satchel containing everything he thought he might need: notebooks, pens, his laptop, 3 books on marine biology, and a photograph he'd been carrying for 6 months, but had never once looked at. He was 42 years old, a marine biologist, recently divorced, recently unemployed, recently aware that he had somehow arrived at middle age without understanding how he'd gotten there or where he was supposed to go next. The island emerged from the mist like a sleeping giant, all gray stone and dark pine, with the lighthouse rising from its northern point like a white finger pointing at the sky. Thomas had rented the keeper's cottage for 3 months, sight unseen, through a terse email exchange with someone named Margaret, who asked no questions and offered no welcomes, only practical information about keys and water pressure, and the fact that the lighthouse itself was automatic now, requiring no human keeper, though she still lived in the cottage and maintained the grounds. "It's just for the winter," she'd written. "I spend winters on the mainland with my daughter. You'll have the place to yourself." But when the ferry pulled up to the small dock and Thomas saw the figure waiting there, a tall woman in a weathered coat, her gray hair pulled back in a braid, he felt a flicker of confusion. "Margaret Howe?" he asked, climbing onto the dock with his suitcase. "That's right," she said, not offering her hand. She looked to be in her 70s, with a face weathered by salt and wind into something that might have been carved from driftwood. Her eyes were the pale blue of shallow water over sand. "You must be Thomas Ashford, the biologist." "I am, but I thought you'd be on the mainland by now." "I was. Got there and lasted 3 days before I realized I'd made a terrible mistake." She smiled, but it was a grim expression. "My daughter's house is very comfortable, very warm, very full of television and grandchildren and noise. I couldn't bear it." She picked up his suitcase before he could protest. "Come on, I'll show you the cottage. We'll be sharing it, I'm afraid. I hope that's not a problem." Thomas followed her up a winding path through wind-bent pines. He should have objected. He'd paid for solitude after all. But something about the woman's directness, the way she moved through the landscape as if she were part of it, made him simply nod and follow. The cottage sat at the base of the lighthouse, built from the same gray stone. It was larger than Thomas had expected, with windows facing the sea and a garden that even in November held evidence of careful tending. Inside, it was warm and spare, with worn furniture and shelves full of books and strange objects, shells arranged by size, pieces of sea glass in mason jars, small skulls that might have been seabirds. "I've prepared the upstairs bedroom for you," Margaret said, setting his suitcase by the stairs. "I'll take the small room down here. We'll share the kitchen and the sitting room. I'm quiet, and I expect you are too, or you wouldn't have come to a place like this." "I am," Thomas said. "Quiet, I mean." "Good." She moved to the stove and put a kettle on. Tea. And that was how Thomas came to spend his first afternoon on Marrow Island, sitting in a lighthouse keeper's cottage, drinking strong black tea with a woman who asked him nothing about himself, but talked easily about the island, its birds, its seals, its storms, its strange and particular moods. "The lighthouse has been here for 150 years, Margaret said, looking out the window at the white tower. "My grandfather kept it, then my father, then me, for 40 years, before they automated it. But I still climb up most days. Old habit. And someone needs to make sure everything's working properly." "Do you miss it?" Thomas asked, keeping the light. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her cup suspended halfway to her lips. "I miss having a purpose that felt larger than myself," she said finally. "I miss knowing that what I did mattered, that it kept people safe. Now the light turns on its own, and I'm just an old woman living in a cottage, waiting. Waiting for what? I'm not sure, but I'll know it when it arrives." Thomas fell into a rhythm quickly, the way one does when there are no demands on time, no schedule to keep. He woke when light crept through his window. He made coffee and carried it to the beach, watching the water change from pewter to silver, to something almost blue on the rare clear days. He walked the perimeter of the island, which took about 2 hours at a steady pace, noting the birds and the seals, and the way the rocks held tide pools full of secret, intricate worlds. He meant to work on his research, to finish the paper he'd been avoiding for months, but somehow the days passed in a state that felt like work but wasn't. Observing, noting, existing in the presence of things without needing to categorize or explain them. Margaret kept to her own routines, which seemed to consist of maintaining the grounds, climbing the lighthouse twice a day, and spending long hours reading in the sitting room. They spoke at breakfast and dinner, meals they prepared together with an ease that surprised Thomas. She was not a warm woman, but she was a present one, and there was something restful about her silences, the way she seemed to need nothing from him but basic courtesy. "Why did you come here?" she asked one evening, about a week into his stay. They were washing dishes together, her washing, him drying, a ritual they'd fallen into without discussion. Thomas considered lying, offering the story about needing quiet for his research, but Margaret's directness seemed to demand honesty. "My marriage ended. My job ended. I realized I didn't know who I was without those things defining me. So I thought I'd come somewhere with no distractions and figure it out." "And have you?" "No. Mostly I've just been walking and watching the water and not thinking about anything at all." Margaret handed him a plate. "That sounds like exactly what you needed to be doing." "Does it? Sometimes not thinking is the most important work we can do, especially when we've been thinking too hard for too long about the wrong things." Thomas dried the plate carefully. "What were you thinking too hard about before you came back here?" "My daughter wanted me to move in permanently. She's worried about me being alone out here, especially as I get older. And she's right to worry. I'm 76, and if something happened, if I fell or got sick, there's no one to help." Margaret paused, her hands still in the soapy water. "But when I was at her house, I felt like I was already gone. like I was a ghost haunting a life that wasn't mine anymore. And I thought, I'd rather die alone in a place I love than live comfortably in a place where I'm already dead. She said it so matter-of-factly that Thomas didn't know how to respond, but Margaret didn't seem to expect a response. She pulled the plug and watched the water drain away. "The truth is," she said quietly, "I'm afraid, not of dying here, but of leaving and never coming back, of this place going on without me, as if I'd never been here at all." The storms came in the second week, one after another, turning the sea into something alive and angry. Thomas stood at the window and watched waves crash against the rocks, sending spray 50 feet into the air. The lighthouse beams swept through the darkness, regular and sure, even though no ships passed in such weather. Margaret climbed the lighthouse even in the storms, returning drenched and glowing with something that might have been joy or might have been defiance. "You'll catch your death," Thomas said, handing her a towel. "Probably," she agreed cheerfully, "but what a way to go." During those storm days, trapped inside, they talked more than they had before. Margaret told him about her years as keeper, about the ships she'd guided, the rescues she'd participated in, the long winters of solitude that had felt like both meditation and madness. "People think loneliness and solitude are the same thing," she said, "but they're not. Solitude is chosen. It's a fullness, not an emptiness. Loneliness is what happens when you're disconnected from yourself, and it can happen just as easily in a crowd as on an island." Thomas thought about his marriage, about sitting next to his wife, ex-wife now, and feeling utterly alone, about dinner parties full of colleagues where he smiled and nodded and felt like he was watching himself from a great distance. "I've been lonely for a long time," he said, "even when I wasn't alone." Margaret nodded, as if this was both obvious and forgivable. "The question is, are you lonely now?" Thomas considered. He was alone, certainly, more alone than he'd ever been. But sitting in this warm cottage while the storm raged outside, sharing tea with a woman who asked hard questions and expected honest answers, he didn't feel lonely at all. "No," he said, surprised by the truth of it, "I'm not." "Good. That means you're finding your way back to yourself." In the third week, Margaret showed him the lighthouse. They climbed the spiral stairs, Margaret moving slowly but steadily, talking as they ascended. "My father brought me up here for the first time when I was 5, she said. "I thought we were climbing to heaven, and when we reached the top and I saw the lens, all that cut glass and the light behind it, I thought we'd found God." The lens room was small and crowded with the massive Fresnel lens, its prisms catching and fracturing what little daylight came through the windows. At night, Margaret explained, the light would be nearly blinding up here. "What does it feel like?" Thomas asked. "To keep a light that saves lives." Margaret ran her hand over the brass housing of the lens, a gesture of such tenderness that Thomas felt he was witnessing something private. "It feels like prayer," she said. "Like every night, you're sending a message out into the darkness. I see you. I'm here. You're not alone." She smiled sadly. "Even now, when it's automatic, invisible through the mist. "I think that's what we're all looking for," Margaret said. "Not happiness exactly, but purpose. The feeling that we matter, that what we do makes a difference, even a small one. And when we lose that feeling, then we climb towers and hope we can find it again." Thomas thought about his career, his research on tide pool ecosystems. Important work, he'd always told himself, contributing to human knowledge. But somewhere along the way, he'd stopped feeling the wonder of it, the privilege of being allowed to peer into those tiny, perfect worlds. It had become just work, just publications and grant applications and academic politics. "Can you get it back?" he asked. "That sense of purpose?" "I don't know yet," Margaret said. "That's what I'm doing here, trying to find out if I'm the light keeper, or if the light keeper is who I was, and I need to find out who I am now." The photograph stayed in Thomas's satchel, untouched, for nearly 3 weeks. It was a picture of him and his wife, Sarah, taken on their honeymoon 15 years ago. They were standing on a beach, his arm around her shoulders, both of them laughing at something the photographer had said. He'd brought it because Sarah had told him to. "Take it with you," she'd said when he'd told her about the island. They'd been signing divorce papers, sitting in a lawyer's office, and she'd pulled it from her purse. "Look at it when you're there. Really look at it, and maybe you'll understand." He'd taken it, confused and a little angry, but hadn't asked what she meant. Now, sitting alone in his room while Margaret made dinner downstairs, he finally pulled it out. They looked so young, so happy, so certain that this was the beginning of something rather than, as it turned out, the high point, the moment before the slow decline into routine and resentment, and the particular loneliness of lying next to someone and knowing they were a stranger. What had happened? When had they stopped looking at each other the way they were looking at each other in this photograph? Thomas carried the picture downstairs. Margaret glanced at it, but said nothing, just handed him a knife and pointed at the vegetables that needed chopping. They cooked in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, and when they sat down to eat, Thomas found himself talking. "We met in graduate school," he said, "marine biology. She was brilliant, more brilliant than me, honestly. But then she got pregnant during our first postdoc positions, and we decided one of us needed a more stable job, better hours. She took a position at a high school, teaching." "That sounds reasonable," Margaret said. It was. It made sense. But I think she resented it. Resented me for continuing with research while she graded papers on mitosis. And I resented her for resenting me, for making me feel guilty about something we'd decided together. And then years passed, and we were two people sharing a house, but living completely separate lives. "Did you love her?" The question was so direct that Thomas almost deflected it, but Margaret's steady gaze demanded truth. "Yes, I did. I think I still do in a way, but I didn't know how to show it anymore. Didn't know how to reach across the distance we'd created, and eventually, she stopped trying to." Margaret served them both stew, the steam rising between them. "My husband died 30 years ago," she said. "Heart attack. He was the assistant keeper here, and we'd been married for 20 years. And you know what I remember most?" picture. You're looking at the camera. But do you see? She's looking at you. She's laughing at what the photographer said, but her eyes are on you, checking to make sure you're laughing too. That's love. Paying attention. Being present. Thomas looked at the picture again, and Margaret was right. Sarah's face was turned toward the camera, but her eyes had slid to him. That small glance that asks, "Are you happy? Are we okay? Am I doing this right?" And he realized he'd spent 15 years not really looking at her, not really seeing those small questions, those small offers of attention. He'd been there but not present, sharing a life but not really living it together. "I think that's what she wanted me to see," he said quietly. "Probably," Margaret agreed. "The question is, what will you do with that understanding?" The winter deepened. The days grew shorter. Thomas had been on the island for 2 months, and he'd barely touched his research. His university had emailed twice. His former colleagues had called once each, and he'd responded to none of them. He was supposed to be figuring out his next steps, planning his future, but instead, he was living in a kind of suspended present, each day complete in itself. He helped Margaret with the maintenance work, painting shutters, repairing the garden fence, stacking firewood. They fell into an easy domesticity, 2 solitary people sharing space without crowding each other. They read by the fire in the evenings. They took turns cooking. They played chess, and Margaret won every game with a competence that suggested she'd been waiting years for a worthy opponent. "Don't you ever get tired of it?" Thomas asked one evening after she'd checkmated him for the 4th game in a row. The sameness, the routine. Margaret reset the pieces thoughtfully. "I used to. When I was younger, I thought the island was a trap. I'd look at the mainland and think about all the places I wasn't seeing, all the things I wasn't doing. But then I realized something." "What?" "That depth and breadth aren't the same thing. I could have spent my life traveling, seeing 100 places, having 100 experiences. Instead, I spent it here, seeing this one place in all its seasons, all its moods, all its changes. I know this island better than most people know anything. I can tell you where the seals will haul out in different winds. I can predict the storms by the way the birds fly. I know every rock, every tree, every mood of the sea." She moved a pawn. "That's not sameness. That's intimacy." Thomas thought about this as they played. He'd spent his career studying tide pools in locations around the world, always moving, always chasing the next grant, the next publication. But he'd never stayed anywhere long enough to see the seasonal changes, the long-term patterns, the deep truths that only reveal themselves to patient observation. "I think I've been confusing activity with understanding," he said. Margaret smiled. "Most people do. We live in a world that values breadth over depth, that thinks experiencing something once counts as knowing it. But real knowledge, real understanding, requires time and attention and the willingness to see the same thing over and over until you finally see it clearly." She checkmated him again, and Thomas laughed despite himself. In the final week of his stay, a storm came that made all the previous storms seem like rehearsals. The wind howled like a living thing. The sea threw itself against the rocks with a violence that shook the cottage. The windows rattled in their frames, and the lighthouse beam cut through horizontal rain, barely visible but steady, always steady. Margaret climbed the lighthouse in the middle of it. Thomas watched her go, then threw on his own coat and followed. The wind nearly knocked him down twice. The rain was so heavy he could barely see the tower, even though it was only 50 feet away. But he climbed, one hand on the rail, and found Margaret in the lens room, standing at the window, watching the storm with an expression of pure, fierce joy. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she shouted over the wind. Thomas looked out at the chaos, the wild water, the violent sky, the world unmade and unmaking itself, and it was beautiful, terrifying and beautiful, alive. "Why did you follow me?" Margaret asked. "I was worried about you." "Or you were worried about yourself, worried that if something happened to me, you'd be alone here with your thoughts and no one to distract you from them." Thomas started to protest, then realized she was right. In 2 months, he'd grown to depend on Margaret's presence, her quiet wisdom, her ability to ask the questions he needed to answer. Without her, he'd have to face himself directly. "I don't know what to do next," he admitted, the words torn away by the wind. "I don't know where to go or who to be." Margaret turned from the window and looked at him with those pale blue eyes that saw too much. "That's not what you're afraid of. You're afraid that you do know, and that knowing will require you to change everything." The truth of it hit Thomas like the wind. He did know. He'd known since the night he looked at the photograph, maybe before. He needed to go back, not to his old life, not to his old marriage, but back to find Sarah and tell her he finally understood. To tell her he was sorry for all the years of not seeing, not paying attention, not being present. To ask if there was any chance, any possibility at all, that they could start again, this time doing it right. "What if it's too late?" he said. "It might be," Margaret said, "but you'll never know unless you try, and trying, even if you fail, is better than spending the rest of your life wondering." They stood in the lighthouse as the storm raged around them, two people at different ends of life, both trying to figure out what came next. "Thank you," Thomas said, "for letting me stay, for talking to me, for helping me see." Margaret smiled. "I didn't do anything. You did the work. I just kept the light on while you found your way." The ferry came on a bright, cold morning. Thomas stood on the dock with his suitcase and his satchel, saying goodbye to Margaret, who looked smaller somehow on land than she had in the lighthouse. "Will you stay?" he asked. "On the island?" "For now. My daughter will fuss, but she'll understand. This is where I need to be, at least for a while longer, until I find whatever it is I'm waiting for, or it finds me." "Will you be all right? Alone?" Margaret laughed. "I've been alone most of my life, Thomas. It's never been the problem. The problem was forgetting that alone doesn't have to mean lonely." She handed him something, a small piece of sea glass, smooth and green. "For when you forget. Something to remind you that sharp things can be made smooth by time and patience and the right kind of attention." Thomas closed his hand around it. "I'll write. Let you know how it goes. Only if you want to." Sarah. Tell her you finally saw what she was trying to show you." The ferry horn sounded. Thomas climbed aboard, and as the boat pulled away from the dock, he watched Margaret grow smaller, then watched the island itself recede, the lighthouse beam invisible in daylight, but there nonetheless, always there, keeping watch. Sarah lived in Portland now, in a small apartment near the university where she'd taken a teaching position. Thomas had her address from the divorce papers. He stood outside her building for 10 minutes before finding the courage to ring the buzzer. Her voice came through the intercom, cautious. "Yes." "Sarah, it's me, Thomas. I know I should have called, but I needed to see you." A long silence. Then, 3rd floor, apartment 3B. She was waiting in the doorway when he reached her floor. She looked older, they both did, but also somehow more herself, as if the divorce had allowed her to step back into a shape that better fit her. "You look different," she said. "I've been on an island for 3 months, thinking." She leaned against the doorframe, not quite inviting him in. "And what did you think about?" Thomas pulled out the photograph and handed it to her. "About this, about what you wanted me to see, about how you're looking at me in this picture, and how I should have been looking back at you the same way, and how I'm sorry I didn't." Sarah looked at the photograph for a long time. "I wanted you to see that we were happy once, that it wasn't always broken, and that maybe, if you could remember what that felt like, you could understand what we lost." "I do understand, and I know it's probably too late, and I know you've moved on, and I have no right to ask this, but..." Thomas stopped, took a breath. "Could we try again? Not to go back to what we were, but to build something new. To pay attention this time. To be present." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Thomas, I don't know if I can. It hurts so much being invisible to you. Being right there and having you look through me like I wasn't even there. I know, and I can't promise I won't hurt you again. But I can promise I'll try. I can promise I'll see you this time. Really see you." She wiped her eyes. "Why now? Why do you suddenly understand this now?" "Because I spent 3 months with a woman who taught me the difference between being alone and being lonely, who showed me that real knowledge requires time and attention and the willingness to keep looking until you see clearly, and who made me realize that I spent 15 years with you without ever really learning who you were, because I was too busy, too distracted, too focused on everything except what mattered most." Sarah was quiet for a long time. Then she stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in. We'll have tea, and we'll talk. I'm not promising anything beyond that." "That's all I'm asking for," Thomas said. "Just a beginning." 6 months later, Thomas stood on a beach not far from Sarah's apartment, watching the tide pools. Sarah stood beside him, her hand in his, both of them quiet as they observed the small worlds at their feet. They'd been taking it slowly. Dating, they called it, which felt absurd for 2 people in their 40s who'd been married for 15 years. But it was working. They met for dinner twice a week. They went for walks. They talked about things they'd never talked about before. Dreams, fears, regrets, hopes. And Thomas paid attention. He noticed things. The way Sarah hummed when she was happy, The way she bit her lower lip when she was thinking hard. The way she always ordered dessert but never finished it. Small things, daily things, the things that add up to a life. "What are you seeing?" Sarah asked, nodding at the tide pool. "A sea anemone, 2 hermit crabs, some periwinkles, but that's not the point, is it?" "What is the point?" "The point is being here with you, watching this together. The point is this moment, right now, with your hand in mine, and the sun on our faces, and the sound of the waves. The point is paying attention." Sarah squeezed his hand. "You're learning." "I'm trying." They stood there as the tide came in, slowly filling the pools, changing everything and changing nothing. And Thomas thought about Margaret, alone on her island, but not lonely, keeping watch over her lighthouse, even though it didn't need her anymore. He thought about purpose and presence, about depth and breadth, about the difference between existing and living. And he thought about how he'd come to that island looking for himself, and found instead that he'd been there all along, just waiting for someone to pay attention. Years later, 3, 5, 10, it doesn't matter exactly when, Thomas received a letter. The handwriting was shaky but determined, and he recognized it immediately. "Dear Thomas, I'm writing to let you know I've decided to leave the island, not forever, but for a while. My daughter convinced me to try again, and this time, I think I'm ready. I've kept the light long enough. It's time to let someone else watch over it. But I wanted to tell you something before I go. After you left, I realized what I'd been waiting for all that time. I was waiting for someone to need the light, not the lighthouse, but the metaphorical light, the guidance, the steadiness. I was waiting to matter again, and you gave me that. You reminded me that purpose isn't just about the work we do, but about the connections we make, the wisdom we share, the ways we help each other find our way. So thank you for climbing my tower in a storm, for listening to an old woman's rambling, for reminding me that I still had something to offer. I hope you and Sarah are well. I hope you're still paying attention. With affections, Margaret." Thomas folded the letter carefully and put it in his desk drawer next to the piece of sea glass he kept there. Sarah came into his study, carrying 2 cups of tea. She'd moved in 6 months ago, and they were planning to marry again in the spring. A small ceremony, just family and close friends. "What's that?" she asked, nodding at the letter. "News from the lighthouse keeper. She's leaving the island for a while." "That's good, isn't it? That she's ready." "Yes," Thomas said. "It's good." Sarah set down the tea and wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her chin on his shoulder. "What are you working on?" "A paper about long-term observation in tide pool ecosystems, about how understanding requires not just knowledge but patience, presence, the willingness to keep watching season after season until patterns emerge." "Sounds very zen." Thomas laughed. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just finally learning what I should have known all along." They stood there for a moment, holding each other, being present. And outside, the world turned on its axis. The tides rose and fell. The seasons changed. And somewhere on a small island, a lighthouse beam swept through the darkness, steady and sure, even though its keeper was gone. The light remained. It always did. And that, Thomas thought, was the point. Not to be indispensable, but to keep the light burning long enough for others to find their way. Not to hold on forever, but to know when to let go. Not to live a perfect life, but to live a present one, paying attention to the people and the moments that mattered, until attention became love, and love became a kind of light all its own. For everyone who has ever stood in a lighthouse, literal or metaphorical, wondering if they still matter. For everyone who has ever been lost and found their way home. For everyone who is learning to pay attention. May we all be both keepers and seekers. May we all find our light. And may we all remember that presence is not a destination, but a practice. One precious, intentional moment at a time.